The courtroom was already brimming with tension before Pam Bondi even stepped inside. Every bench in the gallery was filled, attorneys whispering to one another, reporters clutching their notepads with sharpened anticipation, and spectators who had shown up just to witness what many were calling the most unpredictable court hearing in recent memory. Word had spread quickly that something unusual was about to happen. No one knew the full story, only that Bondi was on the docket and she wasn't coming quietly. Outside, a crowd had gathered along the courthouse steps, the early afternoon sun reflecting off a sea of camera lenses and pressed suits. Inside, the air was sharp with expectation. The courtroom, typically a space of order and solemnity, had taken on the feel of a stage just moments before the curtain rise, thick with suspense, alive with unspoken electricity. The judge on the bench, Charles D. Hallworth, had been presiding over cases for nearly 30 years. He was known for his severity, his disdain for theatrics, and his notorious impatience with anything that didn't adhere to strict courtroom decorum. Lawyers feared his tongue lashings, prosecutors tiptoed around his temper, witnesses often withered under his skeptical glare. But none of that would matter today, because Pam Bondi wasn't walking into that courtroom to play by his rules. She entered with precise, deliberate steps, dressed in a dark, slate-gray blazer that contrasted with the clean brightness of the marble floor. She held no briefcase, no stack of files, just a slender leather folder tucked under one arm and a calm, focused expression that didn't waver as she passed through the double doors. As she crossed the room, the chatter in the gallery fell off, like a slow fade. Even the court clerk's hands hesitated above the keyboard. Bondi was used to this, used to being the center of gravity when she walked into a space that others tried to control. Judge Hallworth adjusted his glasses with two fingers, watching her with a look that was equal parts curiosity and caution. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "you're not due to speak until the final statements. Is there a procedural issue you wish to raise?" Pam didn't rush her response. She reached her table, set the leather folder down, and looked straight up at the bench. "No procedural issue, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear but not loud, as though she didn't need volume to command the room. "But a legal one that cannot wait." Hallworth blinked. A faint twitch crossed his brow, small, but for a man so practiced in control, it was a flicker of disruption. "A legal issue that supersedes my schedule?" Pam nodded once. "Exactly that." A low murmur rolled through the gallery, quiet but undeniable. No one interrupted Judge Hallworth. Not like this, not in his courtroom. "I'll be the judge of what can wait," Hallworth said, the sternness in his voice rising like a wall. "State your concern quickly, or you'll be held in contempt." Pam took a breath. She reached into the folder, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and unfolded it with meticulous care. Then she looked up again, eyes locked directly on Hallworth. "This court," she said slowly, deliberately, "is being misled under oath." That was the match, the spark that set everything ablaze. The courtroom froze, no sound, no movement. The kind of silence that follows the swing of an axe but before the tree hits the ground. Judge Hallworth leaned forward, visibly trying to maintain his composure. "Excuse me?" Pam held up the paper without breaking eye contact. "Perjury was committed in this courtroom 3 days ago, and the evidence proving it has been ignored, obstructed, and buried. Until now." She walked forward with the paper in hand. No one stopped her. Even the bailiff, unsure of what to do, stepped aside. Pam was rewriting the moment, and the courtroom had no choice but to follow. Pam Bondi didn't stop until she reached the center of the courtroom, the dead zone between counsel tables, witness box, and bench, where no one was supposed to stand unless ordered to. But she wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. She held the document aloft, not as a prop, but as a weapon. "I have in my hands a sworn statement from a forensic accountant," she said, turning slightly to address not just the bench, but the room. Not a media leak, not an anonymous source, a court-certified expert. This document outlines in exact detail a false financial trail submitted into evidence during this very trial, under oath by the prosecution's key witness. There was a sharp intake of breath from someone in the gallery, followed by a hurried shuffle of papers near the prosecution's table. The assistant district attorney, Mitchell Reese, had gone stiff as stone, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table in front of him. Halworth's voice returned, sterner now. "Ms. Bondi, you are dangerously close to contempt. That's the second time you've interrupted formal proceedings with an unsupported accusation." "I'm not here to accuse," she replied, still composed, still not raising her voice. "I'm here to correct the record because no one else is willing to." The judge gestured toward the bailiff. "Ms. Bondi, if you do not—" I filed. "A motion, Your Honor." She cut in, louder now, finally letting a sliver of fire through her words. "It's been sitting in your clerk's inbox for 24 hours, time-stamped, labeled urgent, and it was ignored." Halworth froze. Slowly, almost cautiously, he turned to his clerk. The young woman behind the bench blanched. She opened her laptop, tapped nervously at the keyboard, clicked, frowned, then clicked again. "It's here," she said, voice barely audible. "Received yesterday. Marked unread." The courtroom exploded. Whispers turned to full-blown commentary. The press began scribbling furiously. Defense attorneys in the gallery leaned forward with renewed interest. Halworth didn't speak for several seconds, processing the blow to his own system. Pam continued without missing a beat. "In that motion is the forensic declaration, financial exhibits, and a notarized affidavit from the witness's former employer. The evidence proves, without speculation, that the asset report used to convict my client was fabricated using doctored ledgers and falsified company statements." The word "fabricated" echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Judge Halworth's gavel struck the sound block 3 times, sharp and commanding. "Order!" he barked. "This court will come to order immediately." But even he knew the authority of his gavel was no longer absolute. Pam turned her eyes back to him. "Your Honor, I am requesting immediate evidentiary review. Right now. Before this court proceeds 1 more minute under a false assumption of truth." Reese finally stood, his voice brittle with tension. "Your Honor, this is a stunt." "No, Mr. Reese," Pam snapped, pivoting to face him directly. "A stunt is presenting false evidence and hoping no one catches it. What I've done is bring the truth into a room that's apparently forgotten." "What it looks like." There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where the entire courtroom recognized that something irreversible had occurred. Not a crack in the proceedings, but a fracture. A shift in the balance of power. Halworth, usually unflinching, looked down at the bench before him. His fingers hovered over the files. He tapped once, lightly, then again, harder. Finally, he spoke. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said, not looking at anyone. "Both parties will approach during that time, and I will review." "The contents of this motion. Bailiff, clear the gallery, now!" There was no need to shout. Everyone knew what that tone meant. Pam didn't move. Not until the judge rose, his robe rippling behind him like a black curtain, and vanished into his chambers. Only then did she turn back to her table, retrieve her folder, and sit, slowly, calmly, deliberately. Her hands folded over the leather cover as if the confrontation had been no more difficult than a morning meeting. But she knew what had just happened. She hadn't just interrupted the court, she had flipped it. 15 minutes felt like an hour. The courtroom had emptied with a kind of stunned reverence, like everyone realized they'd just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. Courtrooms didn't get flipped. Judges didn't get called out like that. And Pam Bondi? She hadn't just shaken the foundation of a trial. She had shattered a tradition of silence that had protected the powerful for too long. Now the gallery was clear, but the tension hadn't gone anywhere. It just pressed harder against the walls, in the absence of sound. Pam sat at her table alone, her posture steady, one leg crossed over the other, folder still unopened before her. Her breath was slow, measured. She wasn't triumphant, not yet, because the battle hadn't been won, not officially. Across the aisle, Mitchell Reese stood stiffly by the prosecution's table, whispering urgently to his co-counsel. His usually polished demeanor was cracking. His jacket was rumpled at the collar, and sweat gleamed faintly at his temple. He kept darting glances toward the judge's door, like a man waiting for a sentence of his own. Pam watched him without expression. She knew how people like him operated. They didn't expect to be challenged, not in a way that actually stuck. They were used to maneuvering behind closed doors, filing motions that never got read, submitting clarified exhibits that conveniently altered critical facts. Their confidence came not from truth, but from the assumption that they could always stay a step ahead. That assumption had just failed them. The door to the judge's chambers opened. Judge Hallworth stepped out slowly, holding the motion file like it was heavier than it looked. His expression had changed. Gone was the default mask of detached authority. In its place was something more human, conflicted, uncertain, and most strikingly, quiet. He returned to the bench with no fanfare, no grand gestures, just motion. He sat, adjusted his robe, and then looked at Pam. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice lower than before, "I have reviewed your submission, thoroughly." He glanced at Reese, then back to her. "There is, in fact, sufficient material to justify immediate re-examination of the key witness's testimony and the financial records presented as evidence. The discrepancies are not minor." Pam didn't nod. She didn't smirk. She stayed perfectly still. Hallworth cleared his throat. "In light of this, I am suspending further proceedings until a formal evidentiary hearing can be conducted. The integrity of this courtroom demands that all testimony and exhibits meet the highest standard of truth. If that standard has been violated..." He trailed off, not because he didn't know the rest of the sentence, but because saying it out loud would mark a tectonic shift in how this courtroom operated. Pam spoke softly. "Then the verdict cannot stand." Hallworth met her gaze. It was the first time she'd seen something close to respect in his eyes. Turned to the court clerk. "Schedule the evidentiary hearing for 48 hours from now. Both parties are to submit supplemental findings. This court will verify every page presented." Mitchell Reese stood. "Your Honor, may I request a sealed review of the financial exhibits? These documents..." "No," Hallworth said flatly. "This court has operated in shadows for long enough. The review will be public, transparent, on the record." Pam heard the subtle shift in the air. That moment when truth stopped hiding behind procedure and finally stepped into the light. It wasn't just a win, it was a rupture. Pam gathered her materials as the judge recessed again. The courtroom remained empty except for her and Reese. He approached slowly, his tone low but laced with venom. "Do you know what you've done?" Pam looked up, met his eyes without blinking. "Yes." He leaned in slightly. "This doesn't end with you looking like a hero." "No," she said calmly. "It ends with the truth on the record, whatever that looks like." Reese stared at her for a long moment, like he was trying to size her up in a new way, now that the old tactics had failed. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Pam stayed seated. The courtroom was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't oppressive. It was expectant. Something had begun. Something that couldn't be undone or ignored. The cracks in the wall had been exposed, the masks had slipped, and Pam Bondi was no longer just defending her client. She was defending the entire concept of justice, out loud, in public, and on the record. The day after the courtroom had been turned on its head, the courthouse exterior looked unchanged. White stone, wide columns, and polished brass handles catching the morning light. But inside, everything had shifted. The building breathed differently now, as if it, too, had felt the pulse of truth rattling through its walls. Clerks moved with tighter steps. Attorneys spoke in quieter tones, and judges, especially judges, chose their words with more precision, and somewhere in the middle of all that, Pam Bondi returned. She walked through the doors without fanfare, her expression the same resolute calm that had unsettled the courtroom a day earlier. No press conference, no entourage, just a single folder tucked under her arm, a fresh set of documents, and a presence that turned heads even in silence. The building's rhythm adjusted to her the moment she entered. Clerks straightened in their seats. Legal assistants nudged one another discreetly. A young intern whispered, "That's her," to a colleague who had only heard about what happened secondhand. Pam didn't stop. She made her way toward the clerk's office with the same purposeful gait that had carried her through crisis after crisis. She wasn't here to gloat. She wasn't here to bask in headlines. She was here because the truth she'd exposed yesterday was only the beginning. At the clerk's counter, she handed over a new motion, this one aimed at expanding the evidentiary review. She had spent the night cross-referencing trial records with forensic data, and what she found wasn't just one falsified exhibit, it was five pieces of manipulated evidence, 5 crucial documents that had propped up the prosecution's narrative like steel beams in a collapsing building. And now they were beginning to buckle. "Thank you, Ms. Bondi," the clerk said, glancing nervously at the motion's contents. "We'll notify the judge immediately." Pam nodded once, then turned to leave. She didn't need to wait for permission anymore. Meanwhile, in the prosecutor's office 2 floors above, chaos had taken root. Mitchell Reese paced the length of his office, tie loosened, jacket long discarded. His team sat silently at the table, stunned by the dominoes now crashing down around them. "We had control of this case," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It was clean. Everything was clean. But it hadn't been clean. And deep down, he knew it. The documents that had slipped through without proper verification. The testimony he'd conveniently never cross-checked. The witness who suddenly stopped returning calls after providing the final ledger. It hadn't been clean, it had been crafted, and now the scaffolding was gone. Reese turned to his assistant. "We need to prepare a defense for the exhibits. All of them. I want alternative analyses, expert opinions, something to explain how—" This happened without blaming us directly. His assistant didn't move. Pam Bondi filed a new motion, she said quietly. 5 documents. Reese froze. She wasn't going to stop. In courtroom 6, where it had all unfolded, Judge Hallworth was reading every line of the evidence himself. No more relying on clerks. No more summarizing reports. He sat behind his bench well before the court reopened, spectacles low on his nose, a red pen in his hand. He wasn't used to doubt. Not about himself. But after Bondi's takedown of the trial's foundation, doubt had set in like mold, spreading into corners he hadn't noticed before. He turned to a particular exhibit Pam had flagged, a ledger page used to prove the client's involvement in a hidden offshore account. The numbers were neat, precise, too precise, identical spacing on every line, no timestamps on the metadata, fake, undeniably fake. He set it down slowly and exhaled. Bondi had exposed something deeper than a single forged document. She had exposed a pattern, an assumption of infallibility that had allowed fraud to dress itself in formality and pass through unchallenged. Now, as the gavel prepared to fall again, there would be no more assumptions. At 9 a.m., the courtroom reopened. This time, there was no need to clear the gallery. It had filled to capacity well before proceedings began. Law students, off-duty attorneys, journalists, even retired judges, they all came. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but because something real was happening. Pam entered last. Not late, just exactly when she meant to. Her client walked beside, her eyes wary but steadier than they had been before. Something about yesterday had lifted a weight from him, not because he believed he was free, but because someone was finally fighting for truth and doing it with precision. Judge Hallworth took the bench without speaking. He opened the new motion, already read and annotated. Then he looked at the courtroom, not just at the attorneys, but at everyone. I've spent 30 years ensuring my courtroom would never become a theater, he said, voice measured. But I failed to see the difference between performance and truth when the latter speaks plainly. He turned his eyes to Pam. Ms. Bondi, please proceed. She rose without haste. No theatrics, no fire, just facts. 5 documents, 5 points of failure, and 1 consistent pattern of manipulation, she said. I'm not asking for a mistrial yet. I'm asking for something more uncomfortable. For this court to admit it may have trusted the wrong people. There it was, not an accusation, a challenge. Judge Hallworth didn't flinch, because now even he knew the courtroom was no longer about authority, it was about accountability, and Pam Bondi had redrawn the map. Pam Bondi stood in the center of the courtroom once again, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through every layer of the institution surrounding her. The judge had given her the floor, but it wasn't permission she needed. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement from the bench that her words, for better or worse, had earned space in a system not built to welcome them. She didn't waste a second. Your Honor, the document marked Exhibit 14A, submitted on the second day of trial, was used to substantiate the claim that my client had orchestrated a hidden revenue stream through a series of foreign shell corporations. But upon review, conducted not by a defense contractor but by an independent financial integrity analyst, I can now prove that this ledger contains transaction dates that do not align with the operational calendar of the companies in question. She moved to the projector station without asking. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the document illuminated on the screen. Notice the timestamp, she said, pointing at a number on the top right corner of the page. April 7th, 2021. According to customs filings, the primary account listed here was frozen as of March 3rd, 2021. Transactions can't occur in a frozen account. She let that sink in. The prosecutor's office either submitted this document without verifying its legitimacy, she continued, turning toward Mitchell Reese without looking away from the screen, or they knowingly submitted false data into evidence. Reese bristled. Objection, accusatory tone. Pam didn't flinch. Not accusatory, demonstrative. She turned back to the judge. I'm not theorizing, I'm not speculating. These are certified time-stamped facts from 2 regulatory bodies, both domestic and international. The judge raised a hand. Continue, Ms. Bondi. Let's hear the full extent. And she did. She laid out the second document, a vendor contract with a forged signature, confirmed by handwriting analysis and authenticated by comparison with earlier legitimate contracts. The third, a client acknowledgement letter, supposedly tying her client to a disputed account, had been composed using a Microsoft Word template dated 2 years after the supposed signing date, sloppily pasted to mimic an older format, but traceable to an internal firm used by the prosecution's expert witness. The fourth was a spreadsheet, crude. In design, its metadata scrubbed but partially recoverable. The reinserted figures bore hallmarks of manual editing. Values replaced, calculations bypassed with hard-coded totals instead of formula-based cell logic. And the fifth, the most damning, was an email chain. Allegedly captured between her client and an overseas financial agent, the message headers contained discrepancies in geolocation markers, evidence that the IP addresses were fabricated or rerouted through a spoofed server. The server's logs, subpoenaed by Pam's independent team, showed no record of the messages ever passing through. This isn't one bad document, Pam said, her voice now like the rumble before thunder. It's a system of misrepresentation, a calculated architecture of lies built brick by brick to trap an innocent man beneath the illusion of evidence. A hush fell. It wasn't just the judge who was listening now. The clerks, the bailiffs, the court officers. Everyone was still, transfixed, because this wasn't about a single case anymore. It was about the realization that the process they had trusted, the mechanisms they had relied upon, could be turned against the truth when no one was paying attention. Mitchell Reese stood again, hands trembling slightly now, but trying to mask it with fury. Even if these claims are valid, the integrity of the trial isn't destroyed by errors in a few documents. We can correct the record. Pam cut him off, calm but firm. That's the language of someone who's already accepted the corruption and just wants to minimize its damage. The judge remained silent for a moment, leaning forward on his bench. His fingers were laced, in front of him, resting on the wood like the weight of the law itself. Then slowly, he spoke. "Ms. Bondi," he said, "do you believe the defendant received a fair trial?" She didn't hesitate. "No, Your Honor. I believe he received a performance dressed up as procedure." The words echoed like a final bell. No one had ever spoken to Judge Hallworth like that, not with disrespect, but with unfiltered truth. The judge's shoulders lowered slightly. He looked not at Pam, but at the walls of his own courtroom. The place he had presided over for decades, the space he had sworn to protect from prejudice, from power plays, from politics. And now, here he was, being forced to admit the one thing no judge ever wanted to say aloud, that justice had not only failed, it had been manipulated. He turned to Reese. "The court hereby suspends the previous ruling and all pending sentencing until a full evidentiary audit is completed. The defendant is not to be remanded. He is to be released pending the results of that review." Gasps burst from the gallery. Reporters stood. Pam didn't move. She looked only at her client, who stared back at her, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The weight that had hung over him for months, threatening years of prison, his career, his family, was beginning to lift. The judge turned to her again. "And Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice quieter this time, "you will provide the court with a full list of additional evidence. Every thread, every detail. If what you say is true, and I believe it may be, we will have a much larger reckoning on our hands." Pam gave a slight nod. "I already have the list." And she did. She always had. As court adjourned, the room didn't empty with the usual scraping of benches and shuffling of papers. People moved slowly, stunned, as though afraid their footsteps might wake them from a dream. Pam packed her materials calmly. Her client sat beside her, not speaking, just watching her with something between disbelief and reverence. She finally looked at him and offered a small, tired smile. "We're not done yet." He nodded slowly, almost dazed. "I know." But for the first time, he said it with hope. And as they walked out of the courtroom together, through the growing crowd of reporters and flashing cameras, Pam Bondi knew the story wasn't just about a man being saved from wrongful conviction. It was about a courtroom being forced to remember what justice was supposed to look like, and it wasn't over. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with the clamor of voices and the frenzy of flashing lights. Reporters surged toward the entrance like a tide of questions and camera lenses, their microphones thrust forward in the hope of snagging a single quote that might define the day's historic upheaval. But Pam Bondi didn't stop. She moved through, the crowd like a force of nature in a tailored blazer, calm in the chaos, her eyes forward and her pace unbroken. Her client walked beside her, still blinking under the weight of what had just unfolded. Just hours ago, he had been a man on the brink of incarceration, buried under a pile of forged documents and manipulated evidence. Now he was walking back, into the world, cleared of guilt, the bars that had been closing in ripped from their hinges by truth. Pam said nothing to the press. Not yet. This wasn't the time for sound bites. Not when the system itself was groaning under the weight of its own failures. Not when the case had cracked wide open, revealing something far deeper and darker than anyone expected. She made her way to the courthouse steps where the crowd thinned, slightly, and paused for the first time. The sunlight hit her face as she turned to look up at the columns of the building behind her. It was a monument of law, of order, of American ideals carved into stone. But inside, it had taken everything she had to remind that institution of its own purpose. "Pam," a voice called from the edge of the press circle. She turned. It was an older reporter, one who'd been in the game long enough to know the difference between spectacle and substance. "What happens now?" he asked. She considered the question. What did happen now? Because the truth was, the trial had become more than a trial. It had become a mirror, showing everyone what could happen when power went unchecked and convenience replaced integrity. There will be more hearings, she finally said. More questions. More people asked to explain things they thought would stay buried. But this, she motioned back to the courthouse, this is where it started, and it won't end until every case touched by that corruption is put under a microscope. Are you calling for a judicial review? Someone else shouted. She looked into the sea of microphones and cameras, and for once she didn't hesitate. Yes, a collective murmur passed through the crowd. She continued, her voice stronger now, not just of Judge Hallworth's bench, but of every case where procedural integrity has been treated like a formality instead of a foundation. If we want people to trust the courts, we have to prove the courts deserve it. That starts now. The reporters erupted into a chorus of follow-ups, but Pam stepped back, raising a hand to signal she was done. There were things she had to do, calls to make, witnesses to reach. Attorneys who'd spent years practicing under a corrupt process needed to be heard. She wasn't just defending her client anymore. She had been thrust into something larger. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Hallworth remained in chambers, still staring at the documents Pam had exposed. For all his years on the bench, he had never felt the floor beneath him tilt the way it had today. He had begun the week thinking of Bondi as a firebrand, smart, yes, but dramatic. A strategist. Now he saw her for what she truly was. A scalpel. Not wild, not loud, precise, surgical. She hadn't shouted to be heard. She hadn't disrupted for attention. She had cut out the rot. Across town in the DA's office, Reese sat slumped in his chair, his tie discarded, his shirt rumpled from hours of pacing. His phone buzzed endlessly. Calls from superiors, messages. From colleagues, headlines he didn't dare click on. He had tried to play the system, to lean into its blind spots, to trust that no one would ever look close enough to notice. Pam Bondi had looked, and now, his career hung in the air like a question without an answer. Meanwhile, in quiet conference rooms and dimly lit legal offices, attorneys and paralegals began poring over transcripts and case files. The shockwave Pam had sent through the courthouse was being felt across the entire legal community. Judges were reviewing their own past rulings with unease. Prosecutors were reevaluating evidence they'd once taken for granted. The ground was shifting, and Pam? That evening, she sat alone in her office, a desk lamp casting warm light over the pile of files still to be read. Her blazer was draped over. The back of the chair and a steaming cup of coffee sat beside her, not untouched but cold, forgotten in the storm of everything that had come before. She flipped open a new case folder, different name, different charges, but something about it felt all too familiar. And as she read, the same tension built in her shoulders, the quiet warning that someone else's future had been shaped not by facts, but by manipulation, by silence, by shortcuts. She reached for a pen, because she knew the fight wasn't over. It never really was. But for one day, for one courtroom, for one client, Pam Bondi had stood up, drawn a line in the marble floor, and forced the truth to stand taller than power. And when the history of that courtroom was written, when people looked back and asked when the silence broke, they'd find her name written on the first crack, Pam Bondi, the woman who flipped the courtroom and left justice speechless.